Temperature is easy to measure when you're talking about the weather. Just look at a thermometer. The temperature of a color is not as easily quantifiable because there isn't really a way to measure its hotness. We determine the temperature of a color by how hot or cold a color looks, even though we can't actually feel anything. It's based on what we know would feel warm or cool to the touch. The sun, fire, a steaming loaf of bread. Colors in the range of red, yellow, and orange tend to read as warm or hot. Snow, the night sky, a leafless tree. Colors in the range of white, blue, or gray read as cool. Temperature can relate to the overall degree of heat, the quality of the light alone, or to a specific color in an image. Let's look at the temperature of light in this image. Not only is a scene lit by a warm sunlight, but the overall palette of the piece is very warm, providing a general sense of heat. By comparison, this parish painting, which uses warm light, provides a greater variation with the contrasting complement in the shadow color. It still feels warm, but tells a different kind of color story from the first image. This photo depicts a very limited range of color, focused on the cool end of the spectrum, emphasizing the feeling of the cold content in the image in a very effective way. This Wyeth painting, though depicting a cool scene, contrasts the cool with warm elements and uses the temperature of the slight warmth of the sun as a point of contrast on the large field of snow. It still feels overall cool, but not to the degree of the photo. The warmth and saturation of the scarf, then the man's mittens, and to a lesser degree, the boy's mittens, create a focal point for the cool piece. Temperature, along with the value of the coats and hat, and the amount of saturation in the hat and mittens, gives us a point of contrast. The small amount of warm light against the cool shadows of the snow support the use of temperature to focus our attention. The barn and carriage house in the background pull us to the receding space in the painting only after we focused on the hottest elements on the two figures. Temperature is not dependent on light in an image, though, as in these graphic images by Victor Nagai. She often uses a palette of contrasting warm and cool color, sometimes emphasizing the warmth against a focal point of blue, sometimes a field of cool color with a focus on warmth, though she consistently uses a similar limited palette. She changes the balance of the temperature to get amazing range in her illustrations. Using temperature either as the dominant voice for overall effect or as a point of focus is another fundamental way to control color in a piece. Although we can't measure the temperature of our imagery or the colors we use, it's best to trust your own senses. Knowing when something looks hot or cold and using temperature as another elemental force to be reckoned with seems both cool and really hot. hot. Color is not always a flat, perfectly consistent tone. It can have bumps and particles if it's a patch of color, or uneven if it's a wash. It can be applied with Photoshop in a category of filters and textures, and graphically, color can be applied in layers of shapes, large and small. Like people, texture and variation makes marks of color interesting. Let's look at the variations of textural color from wet media, acrylic paint with multiple layers of opaque and transparent color, gouache using strings of color, watercolor applying kosher salt for less controlled application, or oils using the physical thickness of the paint for textural variation. Now let's review some textural color in dry media. Pastel sticks and pencils using the grain of the pastel stick against the paper. Color pencils lets the color weave with a variety of textures that a pencil can make. And ink pens, though the ink is wet, there's very little blending as a wet medium. Pen application of textural color is typically driven by mark making. If we shift to digital and look at a single image in Photoshop, we can play with a multitude of textures through brush filters, either for the overall piece or in specific areas. The texture application changes the look of the color, even when the palette remains the same. Another interesting translation of texture happens when an image moves to a physical surface that actually has texture, like a towel, a rug, or a mug. Graphic texture is probably the most interesting to consider because our eyes see the various marks as a whole tone and interpret the texture of marks as a single entity. George Seurat played with color in this way, tricking our eye to believe dots laid next to each other became a texture read as a continuous tone of color. And this image by Winsor McCay from Little Nemo in Slumberland did the same in a much cleaner, more graphic presentation. Texture can be achieved by elements like topography, coming together in a shape, either as a part of a design or illustration. One of the most exciting applications of graphic texture exists in Carl Jung's Red Book. The imagery explores the subconscious and the graphic patterns, dots, dashes, and textures give stunning voice to this realm. This textual exploration of color is so important to the expression of meaning in this work. Texture, like value, vibrancy, transparency, and temperature, add another dimension to the way that color can be applied to elicit meaning and play with relationships. relationships of contrast. Every time we make a mark of the hand, we create a texture, whether smooth or rough, with dots or dashes. Mark making is a part of the language of art, image making, and design. So go ahead, make your mark on the world. Light allows us to see color, and it also allows us to see through color. Light can pass through a stained glass, partially through a frosted piece of glass, and not at all through a ceramic tile.